Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam shri radhika prana nata pada sarojayo yena premanubhutyasha dattam tam shri gurum bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Madhupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomura Kelato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murdnani Patyakshito Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Guti Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Iha viharati Radha Krishna Kunjarikari Tadubhaya Rasarite Shuddha Siddhanta Dhari Sakala Sujana Geya Krishna Dasa Videya Padam Akila Gunanam Kaviraja Kavinam Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhaktamaj Jai Rachido Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Galai Shila Tahatena Hoilo Morachita Jeba Nahi Bhuji Keva Shunite Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Chaitanya Charit Krishna Upajibe Priti Janipera Serariti Shunile Borohoihit Shriyatam Shriyatam Nityam Giyatam Giyatam Mura Chintyatam Chintyatam Bhakta Chaitanya Charitamrita. By the grace of Sri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojan Avatar Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar, Sri Gauranga Maha Prabhu, and his beloved Parshad, nourished by Sri Krish, Sri Sarup, Sri Rup, Sri Sanatan, Sri Raghunath Das, a graceful swan in the inexhaustible reservoir of Gaura Lila, from which the very essence of Krishna Lila streams in the 10 directions, Sri Krishna Das Kaviraj Goswami Pad. Again today we will continue our discussion of Sri Caitanya-caritamrta. And we resume, we're here in this section on Sharanagati, within the chapter on Sadhana Bhakti, in the course of the Sanatan Shiksha, in the Madhya Lila. So we left off last time with this verse cited from Hari Bhakti Vilas, a very joyful, sweet expression, which encapsulates the nature of Sharanagati in verse 101. Tavasmiti varan vacha tataiva manasa viran tatstanama shritastan va modate sharanagata. Saying, I am yours with the voice, knowing exactly this with the mind, and having taken shelter in his abode with the body, the Sharanagata rejoices. So, to take shelter in Bhagavan, in thought, word, and deed, this is how Sanatana Gosvami has defined Sharanagati. We discussed that in the conclusion of the last class, where we looked at the commentary that Sanatan Pad writes on this verse. So now we're going to put it all together, so to speak. Or we had, as we discussed in the last class, this presentation of 6 types of Sharanagati, or sometimes what are called 6 limbs of Sharanagati, which Jiva Gosvami further clarifies aren't exactly 6 limbs, but rather a whole that has 5 subparts, or an essential part, which was given as Goptripte Varana, or accepting Bhagavan as one's guardian, and then 5 other aspects as being angas, or limbs of that, or expressions of that, or ways by which that is done into depth. So to accept what is favorable, to reject what is unfavorable, to have conviction in Bhagavan's assured protection, to pledge oneself or to offer oneself to him, and to have humility. These were said to be the remaining aspects that are the flourishing, if you will, of embracing him as one's guardian. So now we'll look at a comparative analysis between how Sharanagati is presented here in the Caritamrta, how it's discussed in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, how it's discussed in the Hari Bhakti Vilas, and how it's discussed in the Bhakti Sandarbha. So this is the meta final analysis to get to the crisp concept of how Sharanagati has been defined. And we see that Sanatana Gosvami has given a viewpoint, and Jiva Gosvami has given a parallel viewpoint, which isn't contradictory to it, but is also somewhat different. So we'll appreciate both, and we'll see how, by understanding both, we can further grasp how grand or how pervasive and important and ultimately sublime this thing called Sharanagati is. So I'm picking up in the middle of the commentary that we left off with last time, so the same file from last week. So we had just read the commentary on the verse under discussion, which started with the phrase, having in this way indicated in brief. So we left off there. So now, having explained that last time, now we'll get to the comparative analysis. So I start from the paragraph that says, the significance. So, the significance of the final point made in this commentary, that a Sharanagata rejoices as a result of performing the limb of bhakti known as friendship or sakya, can be understood by reference to points Sri Sanatana Pad makes earlier on this subject in his section on Sharanagati in Hari Bhakti Vilas. And as earlier in the wintertime we did go through these comments, but no harm in going through them again, or we can further review them, and as we do so here with further context and references, we'll get a further sense of their import. So, Sanatana Gosvami writes in 675, Kechedahuscha sharanagatatvam shat prakarakam praya sakya prakare tat paryavasyat vicharataha. Some have also said that being a Sharanagata is sixfold in manner, and that analytically in general, it shall amount to, that is, can be considered equivalent to, the manner of bhakti known as sakya, or friendship. So, a few things here. One is an important hermeneutical point, which is the significance in exegesis of couching the presentation of a view as the, quote, view of some. So you'll see this throughout the Hari Bhakti Vilas, as well as the commentaries on the Bhagavatam by Swami Pad and Cakravarti Pad and others, where they'll mention a certain viewpoint, and then they'll mention that some say X, or some add Y, or something like this. So this is a shorthand way of indicating that a view that is held by some is not a view that's held by all. So it's a way of saying that this isn't universally accepted, but is considered by some to be of value. And the very fact that they are bringing that to your attention means that they consider that viewpoint to be either of value or at least worth knowing about in order to appreciate the point that they want to make. So what's noteworthy, then, just immediately by hearing this statement, is that Sanatana Gosvami is talking about this idea of Sharanagati being sixfold, or these 6 types of Sharanagati, as the view of some. So here in the Caritamrta, this is given as the Lakshana, or the definition of Sharanagati. Excuse me. So evidently Kaviraja Goswami, going along with the way Jiva Gosvami discusses things, isn't couching this concept as a partially held view. He's just letting it be the view. Or he's just letting this characterize one's understanding. So in Hari Bhakti Vilas, we see that this isn't fully accepted, or not that it's unaccepted, but that it's not the only way that Sanatana Gosvami sees this. So we'll draw out the significance of what else Sanatana Gosvami has to say about this, and how statements elsewhere of Rupa Goswami and Jiva Gosvami can also be seen to support that alternate viewpoint that Sanatana Gosvami shares. So, with that in mind, let's look at what he says, and then we'll get to the analysis. So he further explains, quote, "Furthermore, trust that he will protect," or the third of the 6 types listed in the verse we discussed last time, Rakshishyatiti Vishvasa, as it's stated in the verse, and thus also, quote, "accepting Bhagavan as one's guardian, Goptripte Varana," these 2 aspects of Sharanagati, as well as a resolve of favorability, Anukulyasya Sankalpa, and rejection of unfavorability, Pratikulyasya Varjanam, these 2 aspects of Sharanagati as well, amount specifically to, that is, are fit to be categorized within, the manner of bhakti known as friendship, Sakya, in the form of trust and in the form of affection, Priti. So, friendship, here he's qualifying as having 2 primary expressions. One, that of trust. In other words, to be friends with someone fundamentally is to trust the person. Excuse me. I just must have got something itching in my throat. And secondly, friendship can be expressed in the form of affection. So, the implication then is that in the context of trust, there isn't always necessarily so much affection actively expressed. But in other cases, there is. So he's saying, in either case, or in both cases, this idea of trusting that Bhagavan will protect someone, accepting him as one's guardian, these are applicable, or these can be seen as sorry, just a minute. Okay. Pardon me, I'm not sick at all. I'm not sure why that's happening. Anyway. So what he's trying to say is that to accept someone as your guardian, to have confidence that they will protect you, this is a type of trust. And similarly, to make a resolve in your own life and to act it out, to do only what is conducive to solidifying or sustaining that relationship of being an object of that person's guardianship, and avoiding all that's unfavorable to that, that also is a deep expression of trust in that person, and can be seen also as a gesture of affection for that person. In other words, if you really wish to have a rich exchange of affection, demonstrations of trust very much nourish, or you could say, bring out the sense of connectedness in which affection flows naturally. So he's saying that we can contextualize all 4 of these activities, or all 4 of these aspects of Sharanagati, as expressions of friendship in the form of trust and in the form of affection. So then he elaborates, similarly, because of trust in the statements of Bhagavan in 10:51-44 in the Bhagavad, quote, "Any person who has taken shelter in me need not lament ever again," and in the Bhagavad 11:26-33, "Indeed, I am the shelter of the distressed." Quote, pledging oneself, atmanikshepa, and humility, karpanyam, meaning the last 2 of these 6 types of Sharanagati, to amount specifically to that. That is, they too are also fit to be categorized within the limb of bhakti known as Sakhya. So essentially what he's saying is that all the 6 expressions of Sharanagati can be seen as expressions of Sakhya. Then he goes further. Pledging oneself, Atmanikshepa, is to be seen in, that is fit to be categorized within the limb of bhakti known as offering the self, or Atmanivedana. So there's a bracketed also here. In other words, he presents an additional view, saying all 6 of these aspects of Sharanagati, you could categorize them all as types of Sakhya. Or you could also categorize Atmanikshepa as Atmanivedanam, as offering the self, because essentially Nikep, Nivedan, the meaning is almost exactly the same. But then he says lastly, but humility is to be seen that is categorized only in the form of the limb of bhakti known as friendship, constituted of affection, because of its being of the nature of a particular form of affection. So he's saying, but humility, that won't come under the category of Atmanivedana, that'll come only under the category of Sakhya. So to express one's need, or to express one's weakness, or to express one's feeling of unrest, if you will, this is also seen as a gesture of affection. So if you live in a social environment where everyone is sort of performing as though they've got it all together, or they're professional, or they're, stoic, or they're, accomplished, or they're what have you, they're, somehow in some strong position, then if someone comes along and breaks that mold and vulnerably expresses their own shortcoming or their own weakness or their own sense of unrest, that can be seen as a gesture of affection or a gesture of intimacy, which goes away from the tendency to, in public or in a general setting, to present oneself as looking good or trying to impress others, so to speak. So in that sense, he's saying that humility can be categorized better as an expression of affection than as within the category of Atmanivedana. Okay, so what we've got so far is this idea that these 6 angas of Sharanagati, they can all be seen as types of Sakhya, or the 5th, Atmanikshepa, can be seen as Atmanivedana. In this regard, it should also be understood that because Sri Sanatana Pad refers to the understanding articulated in the aforecited passages, the understanding that Sharanagati can be considered some form of friendship, to be an understanding that, quote, some have also said, or Kechit Ahu Cha, Sri Sanatana Pad considers that this is not a view accepted by all. Moreover, at the beginning of his section on Sharanagati, he also describes another view whereby a distinction between Sharanagati and Sakhya, as well as Atmanivedana, is retained. So why does Sanatana Gosvami not go along with this idea that Sharanagati is just equivalent to Sakhya in all respects? This is why. He sees that there's value in understanding the idea of Sharanagati as a separate limb from that. So this is something that he says at the opening of his section on Sharanagati, which we've discussed earlier, but we're coming to again because it's a very essential Lakshana type point, or giving a fundamental point of orientation. So his comment there is as follows. Although being a Sharanagata amounts to, or can be considered equivalent to, the manners of bhakti known as Sakhya and Atmanivedana, still, a particular mentality is required for them, whereas in being a Sharanagata, there is only the attitude, quote, I am Bhagavan's, that is, I belong to Bhagavan. Just this much. That is, being a Sharanagata is accomplished just by fostering this attitude, whereas the manners of bhakti known as Sakhya and Atmanivedana entail more than this. Thus, the description of it, that is of being a Sharanagata, is separate from the descriptions of Sakhya and Atmanivedana. So in the Hari Bhakti Vilas, you have separate sections on these. You have a section on Sakya, you have a section on Atma-nivedana, and then a section on Sharanagati. So he needs to justify why is he giving a separate discussion of this topic of Sharanagati if all the things that are said to be Sharanagati are all just types of Sakya. You could have just mentioned it in the section on Sakya. Why are you mentioning it as a separate section? So he's giving his explanation why. So this is noteworthy because in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, you also see that Sharanagati is mentioned among the 64 angas of Bhakti. Sakya, Atma-nivedana are mentioned again as separate angas. So the same question would arise, why is Sharanagati distinct from those things if it seems to share so many of the same properties? So this is where we can find an explanation of that. And similarly, in the Bhakti Sandarbha also, you get Sharanagati explained as a type of Vaidhi Bhakti, and you get Sakya and Atma-nivedana also explained as separate types. So, furthermore in this regard, it is specifically on the basis of the view articulated in the aforecited commentary, the view that Sharanagati is a limb of bhakti distinct from Sakya and Atma-nivedana, that Sri Sanatana Pad begins his section on Sharanagati in Hari Bhakti Vilas, which he places after his discussion of all the other principal limbs of bhakti, such as hearing, praising, Sakya and Atma-nivedana, by stating the following. So this is a very significant point. He says, Yatokta bhaktya sakto tu bhagavat charanam bhujam sharanagata bhavena kritsna bhiti gnam ashrayet. If, however, one is incapable of bhakti as stated, that is, if one is incapable of the forms of bhakti that have been described thus far in this text, namely hearing, praising, remembering, and so forth, one should take shelter in Bhagavan's lotus feet, the destroyers of all fear, with the attitude of a Sharanagata. So Sri Sanatana Pad comments in this regard, having thus described bhakti in sadhana and sadhya form, the author now describes Sharanapati, because successfulness can be had even by one who is incapable of hearing and so forth. That is, incapable of the other forms of bhakti that have been described thus far in this text, even just by being a Sharanagata. Yatokta, he states this verse. So, interestingly, he's saying that having the attitude, or just fostering this attitude, I belong to Bhagavan, I am Bhagavan's, Bhagavadiyo hum, or as it was expressed, Tavasmi, I am yours, that just having this attitude is sufficient to practice what is called Sharanagati, and that he considers that even easier than doing kirtan, or than doing shravana, or doing these other more conventional, or you might say more straightforward ideas of bhakti as we're often acquainted with them. And so, interestingly, Sanatana Gosvami discusses Sharanagati at the very end of his whole discussion of sadhana bhakti. Whereas we'll see in Bhakti Sandarbha, and as we're seeing here in the Caitanya-caritamrta, Sharanagati is described right before all the discussion of all the other types of sadhana bhakti. So, Caitanya-caritamrta and Bhakti Sandarbha, Sharanagati is first, and then everything else is mentioned. Bhakti and Hari Bhakti Vilas, it's last, but it's said to be more accessible than everything described before it. So, what you call, the hermeneutic of prakaran, or by observing where within the sequence and flow of ideas and sections in a text a point is made, you can also draw out the significance of its significance. You can also draw out its significance. So the fact that Sharanagati is always described first, or mentioned last, but said to be most accessible, and in essence first, this shows how primary, or the primacy of Sharanagati. So that's what we'll get into further as the discussion goes on. So now we'll look at a relevant point from the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu on this subject. Sri Rupa Pad also states in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu that among all the various limbs of bhakti discussed in the context of sadhana bhakti, friendship and offering the self, in particular, are difficult to perform. So he writes this as follows. Dushkaratvena virale dve sakyat munivedane keshanchit eva dhiranam labete sadanar hatam. Rare because of their being difficult to perform, these two limbs of bhakti known as friendship and offering the self have fitness for practice only in the case of some of the steadfast. In other words, only some very resolute or very solid bhaktas will engage in these types of sadhana because they're difficult to perform for most. While commenting on this verse, Sri Jiva also articulates a distinction between Sharanagati and offering the self, or Atmanivedana. So in the Sindhu-tika, Jiva Gosvami says that Sharanapati, meaning Sharanagati, is indeed accepting Bhagavan as one's protector. So that fourth of the 6 types mentioned in the previous verse. While this, meaning Atmanivedana, on the contrary, is establishing one's own dependence upon him. This is the distinction between Sharanapati and Atmanivedana. So, to foster this attitude, this bhava, that I belong to him, I am his, or I am yours, this is one thing. And then to literally not seek to feed oneself or to not acquire any resources and literally depend upon him to sustain one's body, those are not exactly the same thing. You might say that if really you accept him as your guardian and really you have confidence that he'll guard you, then you should act it out. You should just stand there and wait till he feeds you. Or, they have a description in the Bhagavatam of someone doing this. Is it the Aja Vritti or the Aja something? The rite of the python, where you just lie down and open your mouth. And then somehow food will get into your mouth and somehow you will live. Like, to just decide that this is your vrata and you'll just either die or be fed, because you have confidence that Bhagavan will protect you. This is a certain right that some, rishis or tapasvis or persons adopted in the past. So that is taking this idea of dependence upon him to the extreme. So what Jiva Gosvami is pointing out here is the distinction between those things. One is the fostering of an attitude, and the second is a literal activity or a literal way of living your life in a particular way. So he's saying that to live your life literally in that way is rare because it's difficult to perform. Whereas fostering this attitude, while you still might work a job, or you still might acquire your livelihood in one way or another, with fostering the attitude that Bhagavan is one's guardian, that this is a way that Bhagavan is protecting oneself, or howsoever one wishes to conceive of it, he's pointing out a distinction between these two activities, and saying that this first, Sharanagati, is much more accessible, much more practicable for most, and what he's giving here as Atmanivedana is difficult and more rare. But, as it was said a minute ago by Sanatana Gosvami, one can still attain all spiritual benefit even just by the first. It's not that without the second, one is nowhere, or something like that, but as Sanatana Gosvami said in the previous verse, that even if one is incapable of these other types of bhakti, one should take shelter in Bhagavan. And, it says, because successfulness can be had even by someone who does this. So, we'll look at the implication of this. Thus, in accord with the aforesaid analysis, Sharanagati, that is coming to shelter, can be understood to be in essence be accepting Bhagavan as one's guardian, as Sri Jiva has said, and as fostering the attitude, I am Bhagavan's, or Bhagavadiyo Hum, as Sri Sanatana has said. Fostering such an attitude of belonging and acceptance, moreover, is considered something easier to accomplish than even the typically most widely and readily practiced forms of bhakti, namely hearing about and praising Bhagavan, as well as forms of bhakti that are considered difficult to perform, that is, Sakya and Atmanivedana. Furthermore, as Sri Sanatana Pad has very significantly said right at the beginning of his section on Sharanagati in Hari Bhakti Vilas, one can attain spiritual success on the path of bhakti just by fostering the attitude of a Sharanagata, even if one is incapable of all the other limbs of bhakti and does not practice them. Sri Jivapad has also relatedly explained in Bhakti Sandarbha 237 that, quote, everything is or can be attained just by Sharanagati, and that all the Purusharthas can be attained by Sharanagati even without performing ritual worship or archan of Bhagavan. So he says, quote, in the view of Srimad Bhagavatam, there is no necessity of the path of ritual worship, based on the Pancharatra, and other such texts, because of attainment of the Purusharthas, even by means of any one limb of bhakti among the limbs of bhakti such as Sharanagati and so forth, even without that is, even without performing archana, being declared or affirmed to occur. So he's saying that according to the Bhagavat, even without performing archan, if one simply practices Sharanagati or engages in another act of bhakti, one can achieve dharma, artha, kama, moksha, or even some form of prema, but maybe not all forms of prema, as we'll see in a minute. So, Sharanapatyaiva sarvam siddhyati, that everything is attained just by Sharanagati. That statement Jiva Gosvami makes, but as we'll see in a minute, that's a qualified statement, or it's not quite literally everything, but it's broadly everything, or it's all the Purusharthas in some form, but maybe not every form of every Purushartha. Sharanagati thus holds a unique position, a unique degree of practicability among all limbs of bhakti. And Sri Jivapad stresses this as well as other distinct features of Sharanagati at the conclusion of his discussion of Sharanagati in Bhakti Sandarbha. So as I mentioned, in the course of this comments on the Caitanya-caritamrta, I've presented all the points that Jiva Gosvami makes in his Prakaran on Sharanagati in Bhakti Sandarbha, but I didn't put it all in one chunk. I wove it into relevant places so that it could be discussed to compare and contrast it with other points made by Sanatan or other commentators. But just so you know, you've now heard in the course of the discussion all the other points that Sanatana Gosvami has made. That Jiva Gosvami has made. So earlier we had a whole course on the section on Hari Bhakti on Sharanagati and Hari Bhakti Vilas. We're going through the section here on the Caitanya-caritamrta. You've also heard the section on the Bhakti Sandarbha. So with all that in mind, my friends, pay very close attention to this way that Jiva Gosvami concludes his discussion of Sharanagati in Bhakti Sandarbha with a very, very significant point. So he says the following, that Tadevam Sharanapatir Vivritta Asya Cha Purvatvam Tam Vina Tadiyetva Siddhe. That thus, in this way, Sharanapati has been described. And its, quote, incomparability, or apurvatva, is because of the non-establishment of being his own, or tadiyatva, without it. Little statement. Without no Sharanagati, no tadiyatva. This is the point. Sharanagati equals tadiyata. No Sharanagati, no tadiyata. Meaning, neither does Bhagavan actually consider someone his own, that is, one of his bhaktas, without Sharanagati, nor does anyone attain any real personal feeling of belonging to him without Sharanagati. So you could say this tadiyatva, in whose perception? In the bhakta's perception or in Bhagavan's perception? Both. So Bhagavan, he's the ultimate, absolute, the whole of whom everything is a part, so everything belongs to him in an ontological sense. But when Jiva Gosvami uses this word tadiyata here, he's not talking general ontological reality. He's talking in the more applied sense of the Bhagavan aspect of the Paratattva, who's in a state of, personhood, and thinking of those who are his own as those who are there in his abode, or those in whom bhakti is present, and not simply that you're a jiva, therefore you belong to him. This is not the sense that he uses. He uses the word. Just like in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, there's a type of, some of the limbs of bhakti are classified as, quote, tadiya seva, or honoring things that are tadiya, or his own. And then what's listed, or what's given as an example of something that's tadiya. Then it mentions Tulasi, the Dham like Mathura, the Bhagavatam, the Bhakta. In other words, not that the earth or every jiva or just everything is his, so therefore to serve anything is to serve something that belongs to him. This is not how Rupa Goswami or Jiva Goswami are using this word tadiya in the context of sadhana bhakti, or in the context of limbs of bhakti. But when they say tadiya, they mean things that have a distinct status of being related to Bhagavan in his personal aspect. So, meaning they refer to Tulasi or Vrindavan Thakur. When he lists these things, he lists the same for, and he adds the Ganga. So the holy rivers, the holy plants, the holy people, the holy books, there's the special things that are related to him in a way that things in general are not. That's what's dubbed, quote, tadiya. So, although every jiva could be described as, quote, his, in the ontological sense that everything is a part of the whole that is Bhagavan, so they're a part of him, they belong to him, something that belongs to him can be said to be his, but we should be careful in that regard, because that's not the broad ontological sense, is not the intended sense when these terms are used in the context of bhakti sadhana, as I mentioned. So in the Bhakti Sandarbha here in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, this is how those terms are used. So when he's saying that without Sharanagati, Bhagavan doesn't consider someone tadiya, means one doesn't enter that special class of being those who Bhagavan regards in a special way or shows special regard for, without Sharanagati. So let's look at the implication of this, but before we do so, let's also look at an alternate reading. So interestingly, in other words, this is such an amazing, important point of the Bhakti Sandarbha, and in such an important point, you also find a patabhed, or what they call a variant reading. So there is also a variant reading of purvatvam in place of apurvatvam in some editions of Bhakti Sandarbha, in which case the meaning of the statement is as follows. So it's almost, so is there this a on the beginning of the word or not? Is it apurva or purva? The first meaning I gave is the reading of apurva. So now if it's instead purva, what you might think is the opposite, it's not quite the opposite, but rather it's understood in a different sense. So it's, quote, precedence, meaning its primacy, its being first, fundamental, and all-pervading of the path of bhakti, is because of the non-establishment of being his own without it. So if you take the Purvata reading, the idea is that first and foremost there must be Sharanagati before anything else. Or if you take the Apurva reading, you could say the speciality of Sharanagati, or the incomparability of it, is that without it you cannot become Tadiya. So it's not really a contradiction. In other words, either reading you can arrive at more or less the same understanding. So in the case of either reading, it is clear Sri Jivapad sees Sharanagati as something utterly indispensable and part of the very essence of bhakti. This statement is thus one of the most significant statements of Sri Jivapad throughout the whole of his 6 celebrated Sandarbhas on Srimad Bhagavatam. You can see I'm putting a bit of oomph on this point. As was described in this commentary on the second citation of Srimad Bhagavatam 10.51-53, earlier in verse 84 of this chapter, by reference to Bhakti Sandarbha 180, Sri Bhagavan's grace does not descend upon jivas in samsara as a result of their samsarika suffering, but rather only in response to sharanagati, that is, quote, bhakti constituted of humility, such as praying, Bhagavan is my only shelter here in this world, as in the case of Gajendra and others who prayed to Bhagavan for his shelter in this manner. The principle so stated in Anucheda 180 of Bhakti Sandarbha can be understood as a significant import of the statement in Anucheda 237 that being his own does not come about without sharanagati. That is, one can only have the hope of receiving Bhagavan's grace if as a result of having received sadhusanga and thus acquired some degree of awareness and intentness, or sammukhya, upon him, one accepts him as one's guardian and considers oneself to belong to him. In essence, when one considers oneself to be his own, when one resolves, I am Bhagavan's, and considers Bhagavan to be one's guardian, then Bhagavan readily reciprocates exactly in kind. That is, he then regards and cares for such a Sharanagata as his own, or Tadiya, meaning as someone for whom he unconditionally desires and arranges the very best. So yeya tatamam prapadyante tangstataiva bhajamyaham. Bhagavan says, I reciprocate with you as you approach me. So if you approach me as a Sharanagata, of someone who trusts me and me alone and wants my protection and not anyone else's, then I give you that. And if your approach to me is that I don't need you and I'm not interested and I'm fine as I am, then I let you be. So you can't expect to get Bhagavan's grace if you don't want it, if you don't come to him, if you don't approach him with an openness to that, or without seeking that and showing that you have some respect for that. So as you approach him, so you'll find. So if you approach him saying, I'm yours, then what happens? He thinks, you're mine. If you say, Tavasmi, then he says, about you, he says, Tadiya. He's mine, or, he belongs to me. So this fundamental point pervades the entirety of the path of bhakti, or in other words, to genuinely engage in bhakti as it's defined in its pure sense, or the path of Uttama Bhakti, presupposes that one regards Bhagavan in this way. So, thus there's this primacy of Sharanagati. Because think of it the other way. You're doing bhakti to Bhagavan, you're showing some respect to him, but you don't really think that you belong to him. You don't really trust him. You don't really want that your life be embedded with him. You have a separate interest and a separate sense of self, but you're showing some respect to him to get some benefit. Then what is that? That's much more like a job or like a transactional approach than it is about love or about eternal relationship or something that could give rise to bhav, prem, etc. So Sharanagati is the essential basis for every act of bhakti having meaning or having a proper sense of value in the heart of the bhakta. So in that sense, it has this unprecedentedness or this incomparability or this primacy. So, therefore, regardless of how much knowledge one has or how much one chants or how many vratas one performs or all these things, this bit is utterly indispensable. This thing is the fundamental pervasive element that is required for everything to bear fruit as it's meant to, for those who aspire to the prayojana of this path of Uttama Bhakti. So therefore, much attention, stress is, to be given to this subject, and therefore it's being discussed even before all the limbs of sadhana are discussed here in the Caitanya-caritamrta, and as we'll see, therefore it's discussed first in the Bhakti Sandarbha before any other limbs of sadhana. So that's what we'll see now. Another significant import of the aforecited passage from Bhakti Sandarbha 237 regarding the primacy and incomparability of Sharanagati spoken of by Sri Jivapad is that although taking shelter at the feet of a guru and receiving diksha is often thought of as the beginning of following the path of bhakti, this statement makes it clear that Sharanagati is meant to be practiced even before that by an aspirant. In other words, why would you take shelter of that guru in the first place? Because a guru is a teacher. Why do you need a teacher? Because you're trying to learn something. What are you trying to learn? Bhakti. Why are you trying to learn bhakti? Because you're a Sharanagata. In other words, if you're not there yet, you're not actually coming to the guru for the right reason. So, other statements of Sri Jivapad also indicate this. For example, when Sri Jivapad begins his discussion of the various limbs of sadhana bhakti, specifically Vaidhi bhakti in Bhakti Sandarbha, which will be discussed ahead in verses 108 to 148 of this chapter, he lists Sharanagati first, before service to a guru and other limbs of bhakti. Quote, now, the divisions of Vaidhi bhakti are Sharanapati, service to the Sat beginning with the blessed guru, hearing, praising, and so on. These, that is, the various forms of Vaidhi bhakti, furthermore, both individually and in combinations of 2, 3, or more, become means by which bhava manifests because of hearing so. Meaning, because examples of bhava becoming manifest through engagement in them are heard about in the Shastra. Therefore, among the divisions of Vaidhi bhakti, firstly there is Sharanapati, or firstly Sharanapati will be described. Sri Jivapad also specifies elsewhere that taking shelter of a guru is specifically required for those who aspire for bhakti of a particular type to a specific form of Sri Bhagavan. The implication being that without performing sadhana under the guidance of a guru aimed at a specific type of bhava, one can still attain moksha and reach Vaikuntha, though not Vraja, just by becoming a Sharanagata. Quote, although everything is accomplished just by Sharanagati, so there everything means all the Purusharthas, as per the statement in Garuda Purana, quote, those who have forsaken meditation and yoga and taken shelter in him certainly overcome death and reach the abode of Vishnu. Still, okay, so as it was said earlier, Sharanapatyayiva sarvam siddhyati, that everything is attained just by Sharanagati, and as it was said by Sanatana Pad, even for one who can't do everything else, if they do this, they can attain all Purusharthas. Yet, now we get the other side, or we can't run with that sarva to the nth degree. Rather, that everything means all the Purusharthas, in other words, entrance into Vaikuntha, but not every single type of prem, or not every single type of relationship with Bhagavan. So he says that although everything is accomplished just by Sharanagati, still, if one is desirous of specificity, in other words, if one doesn't just accept moksha of any type, whatever it may be, or entrance into Bhagavan's abode, howsoever, if one, by virtue of sadhu sangha, has some acquaintance with the different forms of Bhagavan that exist, with the different modes of relationship with those forms of Bhagavan, with the varieties of prem that are possible within those relationships, if someone has become desirous of some specific type of prem, some specific ishta devata, some specificity of spiritual aspiration, and is able to do so, then one should perform service fixedly and specifically to the feet of a blessed guru, who is a teacher of shastras related to Bhagavan, and a teacher of a mantra related to Bhagavan. So why take shelter in a guru? Take shelter in a guru because you aspire to a particular type of bhav, in regard to a particular ishta devata, and approach a guru who has that type of bhav for that ishta devata. That's why one should take shelter of a guru. In other words, a guru can convey the specificity of what they themselves foster, what they themselves cherish and are accomplished within their heart. So if one has that same attuned interest, if one is, what Rupa Gosvami describes as sajati ashaya, or of, akin aspiration, or like like-mindedness, as it's loosely described, that's the type of relationship that should be formed. But if one isn't concerned with all that, if one is just content for whatever may be, then even that isn't necessary, according to this statement. In other words, we're not here to downplay the idea of taking diksha or having a guru, but to say that Jiva Goswami is actually putting that at a pretty significant place. In other words, to take shelter of a guru, one should be desirous of some type of specificity, which would imply that the person is already educated about such specificity, that they're already acquainted with many of these things. And in the Sindhu commentary, when he mentions Ado Shraddha Tata Sadhu Sangha, this progression, there Jiva Goswami also mentions that first, or before the Shraddha, comes the Sadhu Sangha, comes the acquisition of Shraddha through Sadhu Sangha, and then the second Sadhu Sangha that comes after Shraddha, that's the Guru Sangha. So that type of Sangha that comes with the Guru emerges when one has already acquired Shraddha in the path of bhakti in general, in the Shastra. And here we can add to that from this statement, and some desire for some specificity therein. So the earlier statement that everything is attainable by Sharanagati, even without taking shelter of a guru, well, that's fine, but if you desire specificity, which implies if you desire Krishna as your Ishta Devata, if you desire the prema found only in Braj, then that's not going to be attainable for you just by Sharanagati. That's going to require following the path of Raganuga Bhakti, as we'll see as this chapter goes on, and it's going to require following a guru who's immersed and adept in that path of Raganuga Bhakti. And fundamentally, it's going to require Sharanagati. So that's where we're at in the scope and line of progression of discussion. So a couple more points to reinforce this subject. A further implication in this regard is that taking shelter of a guru for any other purpose, or with any other understanding than the one delineated here by Sri Jivapad and Sri Rupapad in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, is not the quote Guru Padashray, or taking shelter at the feet of a guru, that Sri Rupapad teaches in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Means in the past, in the present, in the future, there are hundreds, thousands of gurus and however many thousands of people who, whatever their understanding is, whatever reasons they have, are going and having this rite of diksha performed and regarding themselves as guru and disciple. So does that mean that they're all practicing what's taught in this book? Well, of course it does, because it says take shelter of a guru, and they took shelter of a guru, right? Well, not quite. In other words, what Rupa Goswami, what Jiva Goswami are describing, they're laying out these layers of specificity. So when that process is unfolding by persons who understand that process, who have that type of education, who have that type of desire as they're moving through these steps, they're the ones who are, quote, doing Guru Padashray and these other things described in these texts. It's not that just because there's some feet and there's a guru and there's a flower getting offered that therefore it's all happening. That, all of these things have, a conceptual import, and the extent to which one is on target or on the path is determined by the actual level of understanding or realization and feeling with which these activities are being carried out. But at the same time, we're not here to discourage anyone or hammer on anyone, and if things are going on in maybe a not perfect or ideal way, well, that's also okay. Something is also good, and there's always room for improvement, so we're not trying to downplay or cast a negative light on things, but rather to appreciate what they are, as well as the potential that they have and what they ideally can be. So, Sri Jivapad, in his Gopal Champu, moreover, condemns discipleship of a guru on the part of someone who is not first and fundamentally a Sharanagata of Bhagavan, as, quote, one of 7 spears in the heart. So this is a verse we talked about elsewhere, but we'll mention it again here. We're almost out of time, I'll just read the translation. A king who is not a servant of Hari, a spender who is not an offerer to Hari, a poet who is not a narrator of Hari, a disciple of a guru who is not sheltered in Hari. That's the reason we're quoting this verse. A disciple of a guru who is not sheltered in Hari, and the who applies to the disciple here. So a disciple who is not sheltered in Hari of a guru. You wouldn't want to read it like that because it would sound clumsy, but that's the sense. A virtuous person who is not devoted to Hari. A simple, sincere, unpretentious person who is not sheltered in Hari. One who is sheltered in Hari who is not a follower of the beautiful ladies of Braja. These 7 types of persons are 7 spears in my own heart. From this statement as well, the primacy and incomparability of Sharanagati can be understood. Another indication thereof can be found in Sri Jivapad's discussion of the limb of remembrance in Bhakti-sandarbha 275. Quote, then, if one's psyche has been purified by Sharanapati and so forth, one can engage in remembrance without relinquishing the path of chanting the names of Bhagavan, or Namakirtan. So, to be noted here is that although taking shelter in a guru, rendering service to the guru or another sadhu, hearing and praising are all generally considered the most fundamental and most purifying forms of sadhana bhakti, Sri Jivapad speaks of them in the aforesaid passage only by alluding to them by way of saying, quote, and so forth, with reference to Sharanagati, which indicates he considers, there's a typo, Sharanagati to be the first and most fundamental means of purification of the psyche, and the most important aspect of the limbs of bhakti that lead to someone acquiring eligibility for the practice of remembrance, or smarana. So, oftentimes people think of chanting the holy name as a way of purifying the heart, or purifying the mind, because Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said, Chaito Darpana Marjanam. But what we understand from this point is that Sharanagati, just having that bhav, I am his, that purifies the mind. In other words, it's not that just, repeating this magic word will have this magic effect. That's also there. Bhagavan's name has some divine power. But we shouldn't limit our understanding of how this psyche is purified just to the magic we're told about, so to speak. But that actually fostering this bhav itself is purifying of the psyche. So purifying that it's the fundamental purifying element. You can refer to all matters of purification just by speaking of this. This is what we can draw out from that point made here by Jiva Gosvami. And I might go a few minutes over here, friends. Pardon me, if anyone has to go, feel free. But I'm just going to finish this discussion, just another paragraph and a half. Otherwise, it'll be odd to jump into it at the beginning next time. So, another indication of the primacy and incomparability of Sharanagati can be found right here in Caitanya-caritamrta, in Sriman Mahaprabhu's teachings to Sri Sanatana. That is, this present section on Sharanagati is presented prior to the ensuing section where sadhana bhakti is defined and the limbs thereof are enumerated, beginning with taking shelter in a guru. This foregrounding of Sharanagati here, even though it is also mentioned again later among the various limbs of sadhana bhakti, serves to stress its fundamental importance. Finally, another consideration regarding Sharanagati is taken up by Sri Sanatana at the very end of his discussion of Sharanagati in Hari Bhakti Vilas. Is Sharanagati considered something that is simply done once, similar to the way one gets married on one's wedding day, or is it considered something that is done day in and day out, similar to the way one upholds one's wedding vows each day thereafter? The answer is that it is both. So, quote, although this description of Sharanapati is presented here in this text after the description of occasional activities, and not in the section on daily activities, because of the establishment of one's being a Sharanagata, as a result of performing the act of Sharanagati only once, as per the statement, quote, upon one who takes shelter in me and even once prays, I'm yours, I bestow fearlessness forever. Still, because of being a Sharanagatas ultimately amounting only to a daily activity, on account of its having the characteristic of daily taking shelter in Bhagavan's abode, as was described in the verse that we're talking about now. Here, this whole commentary, the verse Tavasmiti Varan Vacha that we're discussing, and it's having the characteristics of a resolve of favorability and so on, as were described in verse 676, meaning the verse about the 6 limbs, which pervade all of one's acts of bhakti. It is described here specifically at the end of the section on daily activities, meaning it's categorized here actually as a daily activity. This is the direction. Or in other words, yes, you can accept it as a one-time activity, but practically speaking, it's also a daily activity. So, therefore, the analogy, it's like getting married. You get married one day, but you live the life of a married person for the rest of your life. So, yes, it's only once, and yes, it's every day. So, may that be every day of our life, or may we understand and appreciate these teachings of Sharanagati. May that bhav of a Sharanagata pervade our hearts and our activities, our speech, our thoughts, everything in thought, word, and deed. May it be inspired by that principle, and we can have all hope to be blessed by Bhagavan, accepted as his own, and have whatever aspirations for service to him, love for him that we may harbor, fulfilled. So that'll conclude our comments on this verse. There is a bit more on the topic of Sharanagati here in this Prakaran, so we'll go a little further into this topic in the next class. So I conclude here. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or any other feedback of any type, please feel free.
Hi. I have a question.
Okay.
Some say that, some say that first you need to get, first you need to get Bhava, Svaya for Bhava, and then accept Guru. Or some say that you need to accept Guru, and then Bhava, accept Guru's Bhava. But from what you wrote today, it seems like the first option is the real one. So can you please elaborate on that? Because I'm sure you've heard both statements. Maybe you can explain how does it work in reality. Can you?
Well, practically speaking, we can see there are some different attitudes out there among gurus or leaders of our sampradaya in the present day. So I try to see a compatibility across the board. So this statement of Jiva Gosvami Pad that we discussed today, where he says, he speaks of a sadhaka desiring specificity. It says, if one is desirous of specificity, the phrase in the Sanskrit is, where is it? Vaishishta lipsu. So if lipsa is a type of desire, so lipsu means one who has lipsa, one who has a desire. So vaishishtya lipsya, desire for a specificity. Then the ideal situation is that the particular bhav, the thing that is really cherished in the heart of the guru, that the disciple is also desiring and seeking that very same thing. That unity or that oneness of object of aspiration can create the greatest sense of intimacy and exchange of heart between the guru and the disciple. So this is ideal. So if we say that, if we speak from the perspective of wanting what is ideal for everyone, then we can say that, the disciple should accept and desire the bhav that the guru has. That's, so to speak, how the thing is designed and how there's going to be the optimal exchange and functioning of the relation. So if we speak in the sense of wanting or speaking to the ideal situation, we can speak in that way. But if we speak in a more practical sense, or a sense that has to do with the fact that the way everything happens in society isn't always by the book, or that this culture is practiced in such a way where people are raised in families, the parents themselves might not know that much Shastra, but they want their kids to have a guru because that's a good thing for them. So when they're kids, they have them initiated by someone, and all these kind of things where the culture goes on in many ways which are well intended, but maybe not exactly allowing the full specificity or complexity of everything to be expressed. You end up, for whatever reason, with these situations where someone may have a guru, but actually they haven't really understood what the path is very deeply, or they haven't really matured to the point to reflect on these things in a meaningful way. And they may end up in a situation where they're having a relationship with a guru, but that the particular focus of that guru just in the course of time doesn't suit the way that the psyche of that disciple is attuned. Then there might be a case where the person may foster an aspiration of another type. And practically speaking, we know of, or we've heard of situations where that's observed among disciples and gurus may acknowledge that and still bless the disciple to pursue what is cherished in their heart. So they may even, we know of cases historically where gurus will send a disciple to another Mahatma who can, guide them with respect to that specificity, if such is there. So my personal viewpoint is that we can read these texts in a way to try to encourage people and help people get along the path from wherever they might be, for whatever reason that they might have ended up there. So if we read it kind of too strictly, it can become kind of so rigid that it becomes difficult for people to see how to proceed from the situation that they're in. But at the same time, if persons are fortunate to come into this situation where they're of a mature age, they're of the capacity to deliberate maturely, and they want to understand how to follow the path in its full kind of, full scale with the full attention to detail, then let's also emphasize this bit, and stress that, it's ideal to connect with a guru and have, accept and aspire to exactly what it is that the guru cherishes at heart. So in that way, we can see that there may be a plurality of understandings, but we don't necessarily have to start taking sides between them, or saying that, these people have it right and these people have it wrong, or it only can possibly be this way. If things unfold, people go through stages, they may make mistakes, they may go through challenges, and, along the way, things can be rectified. Bhagavan is, we're talking this whole concept that the Sharanagata is protected by Bhagavan. Bhagavan accepts that person as his own. So he wants the best for that person. He's going to help that person along as far as they're able and willing to accept the help. And the path might be crooked, so to speak, or there might have been some, misturns or uninformed decisions or various things along the way. So, we can't always expect that everything is, kind of follows the exact stereotypical design of things. But we should understand the formula and also, accommodate situations and the reality of people's lives and situations. That's my 2 cents on it.
Okay, thank you.
This is really funny. You're saying something, but you really have to read between lines to to get what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me, Babaji?
Yes.
Yes, I'd like to know if the decision to become a Sharanagata is to be taken gradually, or comes like a kind of revelation or a grace from the Guru or Krishna. And also in the same question, if it should be demonstrated actually to be real on the eyes of Krishna.
Okay. I'll try to get to all that. Pardon me if I don't touch every point of it. So, first I'll say that as it was discussed in the Bhakti Sandarbha as well as the Hari Bhakti Vilas, there's an idea of Sharanagati being in proportion. In other words, Sanatana Gosvami speaks of, or Jiva Gosvami speaks of, getting the result of Sharanagati as far as one becomes a Sharanagata. So there's an acknowledgement that, while one may at a given day, make this resolve, and that resolve, that desire to make that resolve, may emerge in someone's heart from receiving sadhu sangha, what you could call the grace of a Shravan Guru, to hear about Sharanagati, and to then be, by hearing what one has heard from a particular sadhu, or one may read a text, or somehow become acquainted with the idea, and then by hearing about it, then some desire for that can emerge in response to that can be considered to have happened at a given moment when one has first felt the wish to become that, but it may not be that initial budding or that initial presence of the wish can't mature, or in all likelihood it will probably further mature beyond the first beginning that it arose. Just as in our own life, if we think about, important momentous life decisions that we might make them, and in other words, we might at some day come to the conclusion that this is what we'd like to do, but yet we might not actually be ready to go all the way through with it, and it might take time and further deliberation before we literally take an action that initiates a chain of events that will force us into a circumstance related to that, so to speak. Just like, if someone is thinking to, let's say, go to India, they might decide, I'm going to go to India someday, but they might not get on a plane that day, and they might, gradually have the conclusion, I'm going to do that, and then eventually after a while decide, okay, I'm actually going to spend the money and buy a ticket, or okay, I'm actually really going to do this. And then, I don't know if you've ever seen it, I've seen it I think twice, where I've been on a flight, not to India, but to somewhere, and I've been on a flight, and then right as the cabin is about to close, a teenager jumps out of their seat and runs off the plane. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but I've seen it multiple times, where maybe they were running away from home, or maybe they were going off to, sneak away somewhere or something, but they chickened out at the last minute and got back off the plane, or who knows what they were doing. I have no idea, but I've just observed that. So, they might have had the desire, but when it really came down to it, it wasn't quite strong enough to really do it. So something like that, we can see that there's, a gradual intensification or solidification of this resolve. And that may take, frankly speaking, lifetimes for someone to fully acquire. So we can't say that they have nothing if they're not completely doing that. And at the same time, we can say that, the more that really they've actually resolved, the more there wouldn't be any wavering or difference otherwise. So both sides are there, and that can come by a combination of sanskars, bhakti sanskars from a past life, as well as those enkindled by sadhu sangha, or the guru, meaning the Shravan Guru sangha, or, even a Diksha Guru sangha in the broad potentiality of cases. And that, therewith the resolve is formed, and thereafter it can gradually mature. And in the cases of, great persons, it can also happen in an instant. So that's what comes to mind. Can you remind me if I touched on all the points that you brought up?
Yes. Yes. If it is the need to provide kind of actually a kind of proof that to be taken in seriously by Krishna, the proof that we became a Sharanagata.
I might have missed a word that you said. You're saying, does Krishna need to see proof?
Yes, actually, a confirmation of this state of mind.
Well, yes. I mean, we can see that the Ishta Devata, or the Paramatma, is a witness to all of our thoughts and all of our deeds. So, that he will be a witness to the fact that we do have some, intentions and thoughts and deeds related to that. He'll definitely witness that, and he'll definitely honor that. But, of the tens of thousands or whatever number of thoughts we have every day, he'll also be witness to somewhere in the thousands of those, one or however many are untoward or are otherwise. So, everything is observed ultimately by him. So we can say that the extent to which we have a real conviction in our life, then proportionately there'll be a domino effect from that. Just as, like I gave the example of marriage, if someone actually gets married, then there's going to be a change in their life. They're going to live with their spouse and not with other people. They're going to uphold a certain, set of behaviors. They're going to fulfill a certain set of expectations, and it's going to be tangibly observable in the way they live. Just as with anything, if we like, something, it's going to show in how we spend our time, or who we spend our time with, or what we choose to spend our money on, or what we choose to prioritize in our life. So there will be a tangible proof of, quote unquote, our Sharanagati by the fact that we abstain, or we're not involved and we're not interested in things unfavorable to that, and that we fill our life with things that are favorable to that. So if we say to Bhagavan, I'm yours, then, the classical, sort of flourishing of that conviction is that one resides in Bhagavan's Dham, just in the verse that we're talking about today. Tadhama Tanva, that one takes shelter in his abode with the body. So, classically, the sadhus go to Braj, or they go off to the tirtha of their Ishta Devata and dwell there. And they keep the company of fellow bhaktas, and they take the food that's offered to the Thakur, and they sing the praises of the Thakur, and they don't bother with gossip and other things, So all the different features of sadhana, the do's and the don'ts, and the activities that are, to be practiced, all these things can be seen as the outcomes, or the ways that presence of the bhava of a Sharanagata is situated in the heart. So I'll just say that, the more the better, so to speak, but also we can't necessarily expect ourselves to have that 100% all the time. To have that 100% all the time would essentially make us already a siddha bhakta, or a liberated person. So we're going to be in the, the human condition, so to speak, is typically, apart from the case of the highly realized persons, to deal with the mess, or deal with the mixture. And so, we want to acknowledge both sides of that, and thus there's the struggle, or the challenge of following the path of sadhana and striving to make our thoughts, our actions, our deeds more and more in attunement with, and as an expression of, that conviction of, or that bhava of a Sharanagata that we're talking about. Does that address the point?
Yes, but I understand finally that this Sharanagati chapter, it's not other than Ananya Bhakti, the practice of Ananya Bhakti.
Sorry, Sharanagati is not Ananya Bhakti.
No, I mean that the view to become a Sharanagata is not other than to become a bhakta, a pure bhakta.
You're saying is not other than that, meaning that it is that. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. There is no difference. For me, it's not difference. It's a practice of Ananya Bhakti.
Yes. I mean, that was how Visvanatha Cakravarti interpreted the meaning of anukulyasya sankalpa. So a sankalpa, a resolve or a resolution for anukulya, which he interpreted as the anukulya of Uttama Bhakti, or engaging in anukulya to Bhagavan. So to have that resolve was one of the categorical parts of Sharanagati. And as we discussed earlier in the Prakaran on Shraddha, there is also the discussion there that Sharanagati is the linga, or the indicator of one's Shraddha. In other words, as strong as is one's Shraddha, so much so that will be evident in the Sharanagati that one has. In other words, the more Shraddha one has, the more these types of Sharanagati will be perceptible or will be present in the person. But, as you probably remember, in that section, Jiva Gosvami also said that Shraddha, and hence Sharanagati, is, in that context, is not Bhakti itself, but is the adhikar for Bhakti. So, to have the Shraddha is the eligibility, or the precursor, and then the outcome, the Sharanagati, is the Bhakti. So, in that way, it's also understood as, fundamental to Bhakti, and also understood as a conviction that is itself an expression of Bhakti. We can say that the categorization covers both sides.
Yeah, thank you, Babaji. I can see the subtlety and the difference.
Well, please give me your blessings to realize that in my life. It's one thing to talk and another thing to change.
Give me yours better. I need yours. Can I have a last question?
Sure. Or I think there's also there's been one hand up for a while.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry because I'm driving.
Pranam, Shri Krishna Dasa.
Pranam.
Do we have time for a question? I know it's getting late where you are.
I'm fine. If anybody else wants to go, that's fine.
Sounds good. Yes. So I know I asked a question about Manjari-bhava a couple months ago. I have another question on Manjari-bhava. It's along the same lines, but maybe hopefully different enough to justify another question. So, basically, my question is it possible to conduct Sharanagati in relation to Srimati Radharani? Is this like a conceptually possible thing, or?
Generally, loosely speaking, yes. Perhaps technically speaking, not exactly. But I don't want to ruffle any of the Aikantik Radhanishta sadhakas out there. Some people might not like to hear that, so hear me out and don't get disturbed. Technically speaking, if we look closely at the work of Jiva Gosvami, Visvanatha Cakravarti in this regard, it's explained that what is called Bhavolas Rati, which some have portrayed, some 20th century persons have portrayed as being a unique Sthai Bhava, or a unique attitude that we are surrendered to Radharani and not even Krishna. Some people are, coming out with some sort of bold kind of, attitude like this, or trying to present this as like a further revelation or some greater new idea. But if we look closely, there's a comment of Jiva Gosvami on that statement in the Bhakti Sandarbha, in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, where he clarifies that this type of, quote, bhavolas rati, which is loosely and popularly equated with what they call Manjari-bhava, he says is not a sthayi bhava, and he says is better categorized among sanchari bhavas. And Visvanatha Cakravarti, in his commentary on the Ujjal Nilamani, in another place, not even on the Sindhu, but off, in a place you might not find it, way out in the middle of the Ujjal Nilamani, he also raises this topic, quotes this verse from the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and then gives a slightly different idea, saying that this, quote, bhavolas rati, is neither a sthayi bhav nor a sanchari bhav, but deserves its own unique category. In other words, it doesn't quite fit the characteristics of either of those two general categories. So the upshot of all that discussion is that neither in the view of Cakravarti Pad nor in the view of Jiva Gosvami Pad is this type of rati accepted as a unique sthayi bhava. So if it's not a unique sthayi bhava, what is it? It's a particular bhava, whether you accept it as a sanchari like Jiva Goswami or you accept it as its own category like Visvanatha Cakravarti, whatever it is, it's still, like any other bhava, then an expression of or a manifestation of a sthayi bhava, since from the broader sense of rasa tattva, all the anubhavas, sattvika bhavas, vyabhachari bhavas are all manifest by the sthayi bhava. So as soon as you state that it's not a sthayi bhava, you're implying that it's the product of a sthayi bhava. And if you're not accepting the existence of another sthayi bhava, then you're acknowledging that it's a madhura rati sthayi bhava, which is to say that the sthayi bhava of the Manjaris is Krishna rati. And that among those who have Krishna rati, then there are these different categories. Rupa Goswami gives 5 categories of Sakhis in the Ujjal Nilamani. One of them is what he calls Nitya Sakhis, another is called Prana Sakhis, and these 2 categories of Sakhis are what are popularly labeled Manjaris. So, in that sense, the Manjaris have Krishna rati, they have Madhura rati for Krishna, this is their sthayi bhav, and they have this, quote, unique sanchari bhava, or this unique specially categorized bhava, which is characterized as the state of being radha snehadika, or in the language of Ujjal Nilamani, as having greater affection for Radharani than even Krishna. So some Sakhis are said to have equal affection for Radha and Krishna. Some are said to be Krishna snehadika, or to have greater affection for Krishna. And then this group is categorized as having some greater affection for Radha than even Krishna. But that status of having, quote, greater affection for Radha is not a unique sthayi bhava, it's an expression of their Krishna rati sthayi bhava.
Okay, I think I was able to follow most of it.
It's most pleasing to Krishna that they show this special support or this special favoritism to Radharani. In other words, Krishna is not sitting there thinking, oh, I wish everyone was just thinking about me. But he's so deeply absorbed in this, Leela he has with Radharani, that those who support her and, favor her side in the midst of their Leela and in the midst of their, loosely put, their fights or the dynamics that involved between them and the Mon and the pacification and all these things, those who are instrumental in making that rich and making that strong, Krishna is greatly, greatly satisfied by them. And, even you hear these, you arguably, you could say, very astonishing statements of Rupa Goswami in the, what is it called? The Caitanya-caritamrta Stotra, and I think there's one also in the Udkalika Valari, when Rupa Goswami is praying, when will I have the chance to, adorn you with these, decorations, when he's making prayers like this. He even has a prayer where he prays to Krishna, when will you come and bow down to me and pray to me to help you again meet with Radharani? So this type of prayer you won't find in many other theologies besides besides Braj Bhakti theologies or besides, Gaudiya theology. This is something very unique that, the Bhakta is praying to reach the state in which Bhagavan prays to him. And why is Rupa Goswami taking that position? The idea is that he's a confidant of Radharani. Krishna knows he's a confidant of Radharani. Krishna knows that Radharani has full confidence in him because he has greater affection for Radharani even than Krishna. And therefore Krishna leverages the presence of that greater affection that the Manjari has for Krishna in seeking the Manjari's favor in order to get Radharani's favor. So these things all fit together well. In other words, it's not conceptually necessary to, so to speak, create a new category or to differentiate this what is loosely called Manjari-bhava, because the word Manjari-bhava doesn't actually come up anywhere in the Goswami Grantha, but this popular term that they use for it, it fits into the system and into the set of categories that Rupa Goswami and Jiva Goswami and Visvanatha Cakravarti have articulated. Chakravarti Pad just says, this one special thing, you can put it in its own category, but it's not a separate category. In other words, it's a unique subcategory of Krishna Rati. So this is the way I've come to understand it by studying the relevant material. I know some well-known persons out there have portrayed it in their writing as a unique Sthayi Bhava, and that's become a bit of a popular way of thinking in the late 20th century. I don't know how often it was thought that way in the early 20th century or earlier on, but I don't see writing to that effect pre-20th century. So I think that there's due cause for some, attention to detail in this respect, and we can try to keep the popular or public discourse in sync with the way the acaryas have categorized these things for those who are concerned with such categorization. But for those who aren't and who like to just, go about the process in a more free-spirited manner, I'm not here to rain on their parade either. Let them go on if they're happy with that. I'm not here to create any arguments or get into debates about such sublime matters either. So does that answer your question?
Yes, well, it answers, I guess, part of my question. And I'm actually very interested in this question of whether, well, intellectually, I'm interested in this question of whether, or after hearing you, I wasn't before, but now that I've heard, now that I've heard your discussion on this topic, I'm actually quite curious now about whether this whole question or discourse on whether Bhava Rati is its own Sthayi Bhav, or I think you said that the other option, the one that you were defending, is it's a subtype of Madhurya Rati, or I'm curious about this, but there's another direction I want to take the conversation in, which is the implications of this. So today, in class, we talked about kind of the trajectory of the sadhaka, how, the sadhaka should ideally carry out sharanagati prior to then searching for and finding a guru with their particular preferred specificity. So if I aspire for Bhava Rati at some distant time in the future, and I haven't taken Diksha yet, so is it appropriate for me to conduct sharanagati in relation to Krishna just with the qualification that I eventually want Bhava Rati? Would that be the correct application of what you're saying to the trajectory of a sadhaka, or?
I believe so.
Okay.
In other words, I see it that, Krishna sharanagati is fundamental and all-pervasive of all higher attainments, and that it's, the fundamental continuing thread that continues all the way up, even into that most rarefied form of aspiration.
And he's a very perceptive person, right? So if someone's conducting Sharanagati to him, he's not going to just lump them in with everyone who's conducting Sharanagati, right? He'll be able to pick up on the particular long-term aspiration, right?
Parama Karun Rasika Shekhar.
I don't actually know what does that mean.
There's a popular line in the Charitamrita that he's supremely compassionate, supremely attentive, and the acme of relishers of rasa. So if there's anyone that can pick up on subtlety, it's him. Let us not underestimate how attentive he is to these fine matters of sentiment.
Okay, thank you. This is reassuring. Thank you.
All right, Vidyaji, did you have some? So.
Okay, I'm sure.
Can I speak?
I'll go over.
Okay, just to illustrate this point, I remember an incident in Ramanreti when the lady approached Aindra and said, Krishna told me that you should not chant so loud. It's not good for your voice. And Aindra answered, "Oh, I don't care. I don't care what said Krishna because I only listen to Radharani." This is what he said.
Okay.
May I have a question? Just
yeah, sure.
Yes, so in Visvanatha, most material in Visvanatha is glorification of a description of Sakis. And I was wondering, and Manjari, so Bhavartha-dipika is mentioned just very faintly, minimally. And I was wondering, would that be a reflection of what you just explained, that Bhavartha-dipika is this Sthai Bhava, actually, that exists to support Sati Bhava, Anta Bhava? Would it be correct?
Well, I mean, what I was just saying is that Bhava-Larasati is not a Sthai Bhava. It's an outcome of a Sthai Bhava.
Yes. Which Sthai Bhava it is? Outcome of which? Krishna's Rati.
Madhura Rati for Krishna.
Oh, Krishna. Okay. So it's also transitory bhava, the sanchari bhava as well. Is that right?
Well, Jiva Gosvami said it could be categorized as a sanchari, and Vishwanath considered it not quite fit to be categorized as a sanchari. He said, let it be its own category, but not its own category of Sthai Bhava, meaning among the Anubhava, Sattvika Bhava, Sanchari Bhava, among those three, let it be like a fourth. Let it be another Bhava that is an outcome of the Krishna Madhura Rati.
Well, that's a big discovery, because in the context of what is the situation right now in our sampradaya. There's a book.
All I'll just say is that, we read Jiva Gosvami, we read Rupa Gosvami, we read Visvanatha Cakravarti, we try to understand these things, we try to follow these things. Yeah. If we preoccupy ourselves too much by what 20th century person said this or said that, our whole life will pass just trying to rectify whoever said what about what.
Right.
So,
no, I'm just saying this to realign myself with Shastra. And in context for what, without any criticism, I really appreciate your presentation.
We're not here to, I'm like ducking right now.
Yes.
I don't want to say, I'm not mentioning any names, and I know a bunch of people will not like to hear what I'm saying, but, you can read it. It's on my website. I've translated the exact passages. I'm not making this up. If I've misunderstood them, you can explain that to me if anyone has a different understanding. But this is how I've, to the best of my understanding and the persons that I've consulted with, this seems to be, a fair reading of the way the acaryas have discussed the subject matter. And to me, it makes a lot of sense, because if it really were some unique category, it would really be a giant anomaly, because if you see how incredibly precise and categorical they are, when it comes down to the very thing that they themselves cherish at heart and write about in their poetry, we forgot to put that into our system. It's like, what? No way. They definitely fully accommodated this. Arguably, they wrote all of this just to showcase the greatness of that, And then to think that, they just put it on as an addendum, it didn't fit, it's like,
Yes.
For me, that's just too out there, and it doesn't give enough credit to the expertise and the precision with which they wrote. And it's rather us that we need to up our level to grasp the totality of what they've written, not that we need to now, drum up a campaign based on a new interpretation because, we're coming out with some, esoteric meaning that other people didn't know. It's like, nah, dude, it's not like that. It's already there. It's just has to be understood within the system. Anyway, pardon me, my pronouns to everyone who thinks however they think about these things. And frankly, even if someone does think it's a Sthayi Bhava, I don't think that's going to a barrier to entry, or that even this much technical knowledge is going to sour their sadhana if deeply and sincerely they're doing it. So I don't want to go overboard with this, but we want to respect everybody, encourage everybody. But at the same time, if we are going to try to say what is what based on the teachings of the acaryas, then let us, with all due respect to everyone and with as much clarity as possible, discourse about the matter with clear language.
No, that's perfect. No, that's historical presentation development is very important. I'm looking forward to hear your explanation of how things evolved to what they are now in history. Anyway, thank you. Thank you for that.
All right, well, we're way gone over time, so I think we'll leave it at that for today. And, I've added a bit of, some additional points here, so take that with a grain of salt. My attempt is simply to, convey to the best of my understanding what, the works of Sanatana Rupa Gosvami, Jiva Gosvami, Visvanatha Cakravarti have conveyed on these points, and I hope that they're at least providing some worthwhile food for thought and contemplation in the sincere hearts of persons who want to follow this path of bhakti. So, Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.
Radhe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Baba.